So now we have Jackie Amos, who's also a local, and Jackie is a psychiatrist here in the Child and Adolescent Services, and also a Gestalt psychotherapist. Okay.
How do I get out
I'll
of...
get you out of there, Jackie, if you'd like to. Right. You do the talk and I'll...
can't do it till I've got the slides. Okay, actually I don't need my reading glasses because these are really big. What I want to just talk about a little bit today is something that I've called Where Borderline Personality Disorder and Mothering Meet. And I want to give you a bit of an attachment and trauma perspective. This is my PhD research, which I've been engaged in for about the last 6 years. And I'm just going to be able to give you a very thin slice, but we'll see how we go. I just want to quickly acknowledge my collaborators in this research, who are my supervisors at UniSA, Leonie Siegel and Gareth Ferber, and also the families who I've worked with over the past 10 to 12 years, 14 apparently, the past 14 years, who've really taught me how to do this work. So I had to learn, and my clients already knew. So child and adolescent mental health services are sometimes approached by mothers who've got a diagnosis of borderline personality disorder and who have certainly in the past received successful treatment, but the experience of becoming a mother has sometimes led to the re-emergence of symptoms. And by the time they come to CAMHS, the children are often about 6 or 8, and the children are also distressed, and the relationship between the mother and the child has become a source of some ongoing misery for them both. I want to say that these children are often longed for and cherished, but something has become derailed. And most importantly, the mothers find themselves unable to be the mother that they want to be for their child. Now, I'm not going to go through this slide, but I just wanted to remind people that just about everywhere you look when people write about borderline personality disorder, they say that it's something to do with relationship struggles and it's something to do with struggling with identity. And I think that it would be fair to say that my experience is that relationships are a powerful source of distress for people suffering from borderline personality disorder. The other thing I just wanted to draw your attention to is that early attachment disorganisation, with or without neglect or abuse, is thought to be one potential contributing factor for some people in the development of borderline personality disorder. So what I want to do today is kind of explore how motherhood can be both a celebration and a source of new challenges when you are a woman with borderline personality disorder, but also how it's possible to make the most of the opportunities for healing that this entry into motherhood can bring. I'm going to run through some of my theory, which is a combination of other people's work and a little bit of my own stuff. And to start, what I'm just going to do is sort of review a little bit about attachment disorganisation. And I'm going to ask you to think about a mother with borderline personality disorder, who I've called in this talk a traumatised mother. I want you to imagine her as an infant. And we all know from Bowlby's work and then all the work that's come from that, that access to a predictable, emotionally responsive mother, especially at times of fear and distress, is quite crucial in an infant's early development. Where we have this thing called attachment disorganisation or relational trauma, which is another phrase that's used, the mother, when she was an infant, needed help from her mother, who was both helpful and at times frightening, neglectful or abusive of her infant. And this infant becomes fearful of the person to whom she's also compelled to turn for help and becomes left in a state of fright without solution. A young child or an infant in this dilemma can't kind of form internal maps or blueprints about how to get help from the mother that they need help from. And so they can form multiple incompatible sort of models of the same mother. And when you form multiple incompatible models, and then when you're distressed, all these models get activated and invade your mind at the same time, you have no clear map about what to do when you are distressed. And if you're an infant or a young child, you can't make sense of that experience. It's really rather problematic. And what we've proposed is that this distress is therefore not able to be made sense of, but kind of gets pushed off into a part of the mind where it's held separate in something that's called implicit memory, which is just that it's in memory that doesn't have words and pictures, and is only experienced as bodily sensations and emotions. Trauma theory predicts that if you re-encounter a situation that's similar to the one where trauma occurred, that trauma will be reactivated. And if this infant, who perhaps was in a disorganising situation with her own mother, becomes a mother, what happens is that she finds herself once again in a mother-infant relationship, even though this time it's as mother. And infants notoriously require quite deep, intimate emotional connections with their mothers. And I suggest that one of the difficulties this brings for a mother with borderline personality disorder who has experienced fright without solution in her own infancy is that through trauma reactivation, the infant puts the mother back into a space of fright without solution. But the mother can only kind of re-experience this as bodily sensations and emotions without a narrative context or a story to explain the distress to herself. And I often refer to them as emotional memories. Because this reactivation occurs in the presence of the infant, who's just a neutral party initially, the presence of the infant and certain infant behaviours becomes paired with the mother's experience of intense distress. So the infant becomes kind of seen as the source of the problem. And the mother is going to attribute the distress to the presence of the infant because it's the arrival of the infant that's reactivated it, but she's got no memories to attach this distress to from her own early childhood. So when a mother who has been traumatised as an infant experiences a reactivation of these emotional memories, their infant becomes equally fearful because they're very connected and there's a thing called emotional contagion. And together the mother and infant face the dilemma of being kind of terrified but inextricably tied to one another. The mother through maternal love and desire and social responsibility, and the infant through love and a matter of survival. One of the things that I've been working on is what provides a solution for this problem that a mother and infant face. And one of the proposals that we're putting forward is that in an attempt to regulate this intense distress, the mother acts on the perceived source of her distress in somewhat desperate and defensive ways, in much the same way that people with borderline personality disorder sometimes act on themselves or act in relationships to terminate distress. So a bit like self-harm, only the infant is also part of the process. And as the child grows up, they can come to do the same. And if this helps to reduce the distress, then it becomes reinforced. And mothers and children can find themselves in very uncomfortable patterns and relationships. So what we concluded from that is that avoidance of distress is a central concern for mothers who have borderline personality disorder and who are attempting to mother from that place. But we decided we wanted to understand a bit more, so we turned back to ethology and mammals, which was where Bowlby started his work, to try and understand what these defensive actions really are all about. And we discovered that in group-living mammals, and I'm afraid to say that we're just hairless monkeys as far as this research is concerned, so we're group-living mammals, access to resources have been potent drivers for species survival. And group living arose sort of during the course of evolution to allow us to access resources by working collectively. But when you're in a group, there's tension about who gets what and why. So we've had to find strategies to work out how to do that without fatally wounding one another or being expelled from the group. Tension rises for animals when it's impossible to know what's coming next, unpredictability, or there's not enough safety and togetherness. And there's something called agonic mode, you don't have to worry about the name, but that occurs in group living mammals where to manage tension because of insufficient resources, they turn to the formation of rigid dominance and submission hierarchies. And now I'm going to compare us to chickens. Anyone's ever seen chickens in a pecking order? That's what I'm talking about. The reason this works to reduce tension is that it constricts behaviours. You've got a certain number of things you can do from a dominant position or a submissive position, and you can't violate those rules. That's how hierarchies work. And so it increases predictability. Now, I've been proposing in my research that over the first 1 to 3 years, frightened mothers and children fall back on these strategies for managing tension. And they can fall into patterns of using dominant, sort of hostile, angry, rejecting behaviours, and submissive, pleasing, kind of doing anything to get it right for you behaviours, to reduce tension at times of fear. And proximity, which is the key thing in attachment, is preserved at the expense of emotional connectedness. This has a consequence which was spoken about earlier, which is that you have to keep your attention on the source of the threat. If you imagined a tiger walking in here right now, you'd be most unlikely to be looking at me. And for these mothers and children, they've become a source of tension for each other. And what we know from the psychoanalytic research and now much infant research is that some of the earliest beginnings of a clear and stable sense of identity emerge when sort of impulses that are emotional and motor and sensory in nature are felt to emerge from within an infant and are mirrored by the mother and others from outside. But this is impossible when a mother and infant are focused on stabilising their distress rather than mirroring and connecting. So externally focused attention inhibits the mother's development of a clear identity, which then begins to inhibit that of her growing child. And this has some implications for treatment. If you don't have an access to a robust and differentiated sense of self, it's very, very difficult to integrate sort of attachment-related distress into your memory, into your narrative about yourself, because that requires you to focus internally on private and personal experience. So our theory has predicted that to work safely with these mothers and children, we need to activate and integrate this early distress and provide a space where a mother can begin to make sense of her own experience, which is a lot of what Clara was talking about. As luck would have it, we've been experimenting with a treatment that we think is able to do both of these things. I'm going to give you a very quick tour of this. So the treatment is a 4-stage psychotherapy, which requires 2 therapists, a playroom, an observation room, a sound connection, a whiteboard. It's sounding like something you're not going to get to do in the public system, isn't it? And an unfailing belief that all mothers want to be the best mother to their child and that all children long for a good relationship with their mother, and that is the absolute key. I tell people if they can't believe that, then they can't come and learn the work. In the first 2 stages, we try to build an in-depth understanding of the relationship context across generations. So we explore the mother-child relationship from conception to the present day using a kind of form of therapeutic history taking, where we're, for the mother, trying to identify the times in the relationship that have been particularly emotionally distressing and where the cycles of distress started. We then move to a second part where we have a look at the mother's early relationship history with her caregivers in something called the Adult Exploration of Attachment interview. It often takes people quite by surprise. We ask two very simple questions. What did you learn from your mother about being a mother? And what did you learn from your mother about being a child? And 6 sessions later, we're still wondering together. It's such a rich process. We then, and this is what the clients have said, the most powerful stage of therapy, we then have the child and one therapist engage in a sort of non-directive play therapy, while the mother silently watches that through a one-way screen for up to 20 minutes. We have some curtains that can be closed, and when we close them at 20 minutes, the mother and her therapist and the child and their therapist work individually to understand what it was like to watch and be watched. And in stage 4, the mother is gradually introduced into the play space, and she's supported to watch, as she has been doing, from behind the window. And the therapist looks for moments of traumatic reactivation, working with them as they occur. And then the individual therapy resumes. So how does this all come together? I'm going to just offer you one little snippet of how we think this is useful. I'm going to talk a little bit about the one-way screen. So I would suggest to you that the one-way screen is integrating those 2 focus of treatments that I introduced earlier. So the child, if we go back to my very early theory bit, is the most potent trigger for the mother's distress by virtue of having become paired with that in infancy. But in the home and in the home environment, defensive action is the solution to this distress. So if we were just to use the child to activate the mother's distress, that could be problematic for both mother and child. We put the mother in the position of continuing to relate to her child in ways that seriously distress her. So we pop a one-way screen in the way, and then we put the child in front of the mother again. And it allows us to repeatedly present to the mother the trigger until we can activate, make sense of, and put her distress into the context of the earlier trauma which has usually led to the distress in the first place. And this is done in the context of support. The mother is supported by her therapist to understand what it is that's been distressing in this relationship with her infant and child, her own early experiences, and what it was in that moment behind the screen that triggered that distress, which allows the mother and her therapist to put together the pieces of a puzzle of the here and now relationship, the immediate past of the relationship with her child and infant, and the more distant past of the relationship with her own caregivers, making sense of the automatic and unaware reactions as they emerge in real time in the session. I could go on. I've got 5 minutes, but I've come to the end of my talk because I was so concerned about going over time. What I'll just say is that what we find is that by working with the mother's activated trauma in this way, she comes to be able to be with her child even in the moments that previously would have triggered the distress with a kind of sense of calm and connection. And what that does is it frees the mother up to become the mother that she longs to be. And the wonderful side effect is that frees the child up to relate to the mother that they long to have. Since I've got a couple of minutes, I'll add some things. One of the things that's quite interesting in the context of today is that people are talking about how difficult it is to allow these very intensive programs to kind of meet the need because there's more need than room for programs. But one of the things we've found is that for many of our mothers, just part of this process is enough. For others, the whole process is required. But I think the thing that I really kind of sit with is the hope, because what I think this brought to me as a clinician, and what I know it's brought to the mothers we've worked with, is the hope that the distress from the past, that maybe is even out of awareness because it happened early in life, that then perhaps gets compounded by other life experiences, doesn't have to hold this mother and child hostage. And I think that when a mother and a very distressed child come for help, and I can hold a position of knowing that the distress that is being brought to me is actually the key for the healing, then we have what is in fact a situation that can look hopeless, but is actually got at its core the most remarkable hope. And I think that's all I'm going to say for now.
That was quite beautiful. A philosopher and a poet. Okay.